As Veronica sat in her car, the unsettling realization began to settle in. The fact that the officer, Matthews, had made such an assumption about her, and worse, had gone so far as to make a public spectacle of it, was just one part of the equation. But the arrival of 2 more police cars, the new officer, and the heavy air of uncertainty hanging over the situation, only added to the tension she could feel creeping through her. She looked down at her phone screen once more. Judge Anderson was still calling, and the ringing was starting to break her concentration. Veronica hesitated before pressing the button to answer. Her hand was still slightly shaking from the emotional rush of confronting Matthews, but she didn't have the luxury of taking a break. Not today. Veronica, Judge Anderson's voice came through the line, sharp and filled with concern. Are you all right? I just heard about what happened. Are you safe? Veronica glanced up at the rearview mirror again, seeing the officers still in conversation. She could feel their eyes on her, but now, it wasn't just about Matthews, it was about what would come next. There were layers to this injustice, one she hadn't even fully grasped yet. I'm fine, Anderson, she replied, her voice steady but strained. I've just been held up by an officer who decided to profile me based on nothing but the color of my skin. I'm sure you can imagine the rest. The usual. God, Anderson muttered. I'm glad you're okay, but this doesn't end here. We need to make sure this is reported. They can't just walk away from this. Veronica let out a slow, controlled breath. I'm already on it. I'm not just letting this go. But the real issue here is what's coming next. These situations always have a way of snowballing, and I can already feel that in the air. She glanced at the squad cars again, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Stay calm, Veronica. We'll deal with it. I'll reach out to the department personally, Anderson offered. Before she could respond, a movement in the rearview mirror caught her eye again. One of the officers, this new officer, was walking toward her car. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid. His eyes were fixed on her, unwavering, and something about his presence screamed authority. He didn't look like someone who was ready to apologize or admit fault. He looked like someone who was ready to escalate things. Veronica turned her attention back to the phone, her voice now tight. I'll call you back, Anderson. Something's happening here. She quickly ended the call and pressed the end button with a sharp tap of her finger. As the officer approached, Veronica quickly collected herself, locking eyes with him in the rearview mirror. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her next move. If anything, this was her chance to push back. She had to do it, not just for herself, but for every black person who had ever been wrongly stopped or targeted. Her hands remained firm on the wheel as she turned to face the officer when he came into view. Ma'am, the officer said, his voice cold and formal, I'm Officer Blake. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car. Veronica's breath caught for a moment, her heart thumping harder against her ribs. I already told your colleagues I'm not stepping out of this car unless you have a valid reason for it. And as of right now, none of you have given me one. Officer Blake's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze hardening. You need to step out, ma'am, he repeated, his voice a touch more forceful. We're not going to play games here. I'm not playing games either, Veronica shot back, her voice laced with authority. But you will not treat me like I'm a criminal because of the color of my skin. You need to call your supervisor, and we'll handle this properly. A flicker of something crossed Officer Blake's face, disbelief, maybe frustration. He wasn't expecting this kind of response, not from someone who looked like Veronica. But Veronica could feel the power of the moment. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She wasn't just any woman. She wasn't some random civilian he could intimidate with his badge. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order? Blake's voice was rising now, his eyes narrowing. Veronica paused, her eyes locking with his. I'm refusing to comply with an unlawful order based on your prejudices. Yes, I am. And I'm giving you one chance to call your supervisor right now, or I will take action myself. The tension between them escalated, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Officer Blake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to escalate things further, maybe physically. But then, just as quickly, his expression faltered. He realized he couldn't push her any further, not yet. Not without consequences. Fine, he muttered. I'll call it in. But don't think this is over. As he stepped away to use his radio, Veronica glanced at the other officers. Matthews was still standing by his squad car, looking like he had just realized he had made a monumental error. Officer Jackson, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, turned away, her face unreadable. But Veronica knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. The system that had allowed Matthews to act this way, that had enabled him to think he could get away with profiling a federal judge, was being exposed. As Blake radioed in for his supervisor, Veronica felt a surge of determination course through her. She had to be the change. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the same system. But what came next? How would the department react when the full extent of their mistake was laid bare? A few minutes later, Sergeant Clark returned, his face grim. Veronica could see the regret in his eyes, but she wasn't ready to accept an apology. Not yet. Veronica Williams? Clark asked, his voice hesitant. Veronica nodded. I'm Sergeant Clark. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Veronica repeated. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling. Your officers assumed I was a criminal simply because of my race. You don't get to call that a misunderstanding. Clark looked down for a moment, and then back up at her. We're going to take this seriously, ma'am. I assure you. Matthews is being reprimanded, and this will be handled. But I need you to understand, this is not typical behavior for this department. Typical or not, it happened, Veronica said, her voice unwavering. You need to fix this. But just as she spoke, her phone buzzed again. She looked down to see another call from Judge Anderson. I'll handle this, Veronica said firmly, turning her back on Clark and taking the call. But as she answered, the faint sound of tires screeching on the road broke her concentration. She whipped her head around, and her stomach dropped. One of the squad cars had started to move toward her, a flash of blue and red lights lighting up the street in a frenzy. Get back in the car! Clark shouted. But it was too late. The car was speeding toward her. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.